This isn't going to be a standard review. I want to focus on some of the key themes and questions that Scorcese brings up throughout the film. For me, the main question that kept penetrating the depths of my mind and that I could no longer resolve nor remove by the end of the colossal behemoth of a film was, is Molly white? But perhaps more importantly, the question of whether Ernest is a villain or a victim of circumstance is at the heart of Killers of the Flower Moon. Now you might think, if you've seen the film, this is a ridiculous question to ask. And by the way, I will go into spoilers. If you haven't seen the film, if you're not interested in hearing what happens next, log off now. I've warned you. Anyway, let's get back to the content. At face value, Ernest's malicious actions throughout show a villainous nature. He commits various unspeakable atrocities, manipulates others, lies and robs his way through Osage County, and above all else, betrays those closest to him to satiate nothing but his love of endless money. Now you could say Ernest was always evil. From the moment he had a glint in his eye when money turned up, and he let this greed disguise himself from the reality that he was poisoning his own wife and destroying the very foundation of his family and happiness. And I suppose if you came to this conclusion that Ernest was just evil, an irredeemable character, motivated by greed and lust and all of the worst sins you could possibly imagine, then I can't really refute you. That is a genuinely decent interpretation of his character. But I think that interpretation only tells part of the story and fails to get at the main message Scorsese was trying to relay through Ernest, a message that permeates throughout the plot. You see, Scorsese tries to show that violence is not straightforward. Even acts of great evil and violence can be carried out by those who believe they are acting in the self-interest of their people. And so principles like loyalty and family can be intertwined with acts of great violence, and no character demonstrates the messiness, the ambiguities of evil greater than Ernest. And so to evaluate the film's central narrative, we have to take a deep look at Ernest. Now you might think, wait, it sounds like you're missing the actual main villain of the whole plot, King Hale. I mean, he's clearly the most evil character. He's the orchestrator of all the murders. He is the one that has no loyalty, relentless greed, single-handedly destroys an entire community and his own family. But I think in many ways, King Hale is the least relevant and interesting character to the central message of the plot. This is because of one reason and one reason only. He's remarkably predictable. As a standard out-and-out psychopath who will never reflect or switch course or feel an internal conflict or regret or love, Hale is remarkably predictable. He never changes as a character. Even after he is arrested and disgraced, with no chance of comeback, he tries to maintain his image as a friend of the Osage. Whereas Ernest is the beating heart of the movie. He is the character who can change. The character who, much like us, isn't destined to become a villain. And even when he does, deludes himself into believing he isn't really one. And so his choices, inaction, moral conflicts, and trials are relatable on a fundamentally personal level and reveal profound truths about human nature. Leonardo DiCaprio puts this best.
Of Ernest Burkhart, I found absolutely fascinating.
Ernest comes to Oklahoma and ultimately falls in love with Molly Kyle.
William K. Hale used that as an opportunity to prey upon her wealth.
Ernest is under a very strong influence of his uncle. He finds himself getting deeper into murderous plans.
Ernest's a real-life representation of the incredible greed of that time.
From the beginning of the film, Scorsese establishes that Ernest is a complicated character. On the one hand, he is characterized as highly gullible and so vulnerable, loyal, low on intellect, but charmingly straightforward and loving. On the other hand, he is presented as so greedy and lacking in ambition, where then rather than stake out his own claim to the wealth of Osage County, he is ready to resort to extreme measures such as violence and thievery to achieve the ends he desires.
Money flows freely here now.
I do love that money, sir.
And I said earlier that the greatness of Killers of the Flower Moon comes from this representation of characters as not only antagonists, as having a very complicated nature where their goodness justifies their evil and a self-sustaining duality between good and evil is created. But I think at the core of Killers of the Flower Moon is an even more sophisticated message. A message that gets at the deepest roots of our own delusions and the power of violence and chaos to prevent such a separation between the good father and the evil killer to actually exist in reality. Therefore, to me, the film is really about the ways in which our attempts to attach moral corruption to our sense of morality and goodness slowly rip at the seams of the fragile reality we concoct until one day the facade is torn apart. You see, Ernest could never really separate the two sides to him. He might have believed he could, but this attempt to maintain a facade would undo all that was good about him. He believed that the murder of Molly's family would allow him to provide for his, while maintaining loyalty to his broader family, in particular uncle. But the genius of the plot stems from the ways in which it shows that such a divide is impossible. Not only does the whole thing unravel and the federal government get involved to resolve the murders, but his relationship with his kids and wife, who he deeply loved, collapses. And he finds out he was so blinded to reality by his trust in King Hale that he was inadvertently poisoning his wife. For me, this represents the way in which violence is often committed through a veil of morality, a facade of respectability, not wanton psychopathy like King Hale. But the moral corruption it unleashes often destroys this separation and impacts the things we use to justify said violence. In doing so, evil almost takes on a life of its own, the chaos it generates consuming all that which we care about. And this is why Killers of the Flower Moon and the central message it portrays through Ernest's character is so powerful. It represents the reality of this type of violence, because in fact, it's true. Ernest's granddaughter verified that Molly and Ernest had an exceptionally complicated relationship, and to this day, she believes that they actually did love each other, however crazy that might seem. And this is because, as human beings, we're complicated. We're often contradictory, we justify certain things based on others, we have certain emotions, delusions. War and atrocities are often more than not very intimate and driven by a mixture of self-delusion, moral corruption, where the latter begins to take over the former. Otherwise, good people, motivated by deep feelings of love and care for those closest to them, can be sold an equally great hatred of the other by a mixture of seemingly absurd fiction and emotional manipulation. In World War II, many Nazis were otherwise intelligent, often geniuses in some cases, were more than willing to engage in horrible atrocities motivated by ridiculous myths and fervent ethnic nationalism. This is our very nature. We are fundamentally irrational, rational, messy, ordered at the same time. But the very violence this unleashed ended up tearing apart their nation and above all else, their very family. And this gets to our fundamental human nature. And that's what Killers of the Flower Moon is fundamentally about, and why it is perhaps the best film Scorcese has ever created. Not only does it portray the messiness and complexity of real life, but it cuts at the heart of the sad, often contradictory reality of vicious violence.